There's no time like the present, so let's get into this. As usual, the timestamps and Amazon affiliate links are in the video description, and if you buy anything through them, I'll get a small kickback which helps the channel, but please watch the review before making a purchasing decision, know what you're getting yourself into. Unboxing experience, well, it's the same as pretty much any other sort of budget-ish case. This one's about £50, $60. Not much to say there, so let's get right into the case. As the A suggests, this is the Air version of the original P300 case, which means we have a better ventilated front panel. Speaking of which, the front panel is almost entirely painted and perforated steel. A nice choice to make the front feel more solid, but it's a large face, so it will be prone to denting if you're not careless, or if you're not careful. Careless. Up top we have what appears to be some sort of grill or louver, but it's just solid plastic to the back, so there's no additional intake to be gained here, same for the bottom. I/O-wise, we have a couple of USB 3.0 ports, mic and headphone jacks, a reset button, and a more prominent central power button, which is backlit. And lastly, for the top, we have a 120 or 140mm fan position with a dust filter to prevent dust from settling in your system, not an invitation to use it as an intake. Checking out the rear, it's a very standard setup. Lower power supply unit position, central PCI Express slots without a fancy and fiddly cover plate, and a top rear I/O and 120mm radiator and or fan position. The included fan being a 3-pin, nearly no-name fan if it wasn't for Phanteks splashing out on a sticker. The base has little to offer apart from some screws to remove the drive cage and a rear power supply unit intake filter with the standard rear removal and replacement motion. We also have some foam padded feet which are pretty handy for moving your system around your desk. Passenger side panel, it's just steel, not much to see here, but driver side we've got some clean annealed glass. Just kidding, it is tempered and lacks the visual thumb screws which matches the minimal design. There is quite the blackout perimeter to the glass though. We also have a fully covered basement with the Phanteks logo pressed into the front, which just above behind the glass houses a small LED strip behind the glass for some accent lighting. It's more of a LED with a diffuser than an LED strip. Anyway. The lack of thumb screws to the face of the glass is converted into captive thumb screws to the rear. I presume the captive bit refers to the prison service, since half of the time they make you their bitch. But jokes aside, they're annoying to remove and replace, just way too fiddly to use perfectly, and have a habit of getting stuck. Once they're out of the way, the glass panel can be removed simply. Just make sure you support the lower edge well. The steel side panel is a little easier thanks to the hooks holding it in place, but alas, the hook giveth and taketh away. By which I mean, if you pack the inside of the case well enough with cables and the like, they make replacing the panel a bit of a chore. Panel flex is good, despite the lack of a protrusion to prevent it buckling. They've opted for some thicker steel and using the inside guiding edges for bracing. Back to the captive thumb screws quickly though. Notice the thread section is deeper than the captive protrusion. This is what appears to cause problems by not fully disengaging with the chassis while simultaneously engaging with the captive steel protrusion and getting stuck sometimes. Last but not least is the front panel, which takes a swift tug to free. The panel is connected using a ball and socket mechanism, which is so much better than the old socket arrangement. This is very similar to the front panel connectors of the Evolve cases, just plastic and not metal. Just to be super thorough, here's the internal details of the top and bottom sections of the front panel, all blocked off as said earlier, no grills or ventilation to be found here. Back to the chassis, the front can take up to a 280mm radiator with a couple of 140mm fans, and of course a smaller 240mm radiator with a couple of 120mm fans. But you can clearly see that the cutout shape isn't well designed for 140mm fans, since it doesn't extend very far to the left to take full advantage of the outer edge of the blade where the air moves fastest. Just below the fan section is a front-mounted drive cage, something I prefer to a side access one, since the front panel is really easy to remove, easier than the side panel. Internally, up top, there's a small plastic box which contains the business end of the front button and LED, and there's a second unit just to the left, just behind, for the rest of the front I/O. Just to the left, there's plenty of space top to bottom for cable routing through to the main compartment, and the rest of the motherboard tray hosts a complete set of standoffs for an ATX board, and a couple of which are the infamously handy post variant. To the base, there's a couple of cable routing holes for ATX boards, and a couple slightly higher up to the left for micro ATX boards. Up top, there's just the I/O boxes we saw earlier, and the 140 and 120mm fan position, and the rear is, as it was earlier, nothing extra to declare. A quick stop around the back shows us the really helpful dedicated cable routing channel with a couple of straps restraining the cables from the front I/O section up top. Following the 3-pin cable from the rear fan across presents some more cable management holes, the right one not being completely open up top as it was with the Neo Air, something I thought was a no-brainer considering they hail from the same source pretty much, but apparently not. Just under the well-sized rear socket access void are the positions for the 2.5-inch drives. I say drives, you just get one 2.5-inch drive sled, but you can buy an additional one for £10 or $11, which could pretty much kill what could be an excellent value for money. But yeah, side thought, why add the screws to the drive sled considering you don't get one or may never get one? It kind of seems like encouragement to me. Anyway, there's a blank space to the left, which along with the lack of the second drive sled makes this look like the car with all the blank buttons, which kind of is since it's relatively cheap-ish. Moving on, in the basement section, we have that drive cage, which can be removed if you want to, and a slot for the rear power supply unit, which allows for 200mm of power supply unit, which actually translates to more like 160mm of power supply unit if you want to retain the drive cage and your hair. It also has some foam pads on raised dimples, and there's a sneaky cable trailing through to power the LED strip seen earlier. The top panel can be removed after releasing an excessive amount of screws. 15 in total. I see the point of them, but there's just a lot of them to get rid of. There's also a couple of sneaky ones to the front, and these screws are a royal pain. A bit more meat on them next time would be great. I did discover later on, based on how the edges are designed, that you should remove this panel by lifting the window side up and over the steel side panel section, but it's a little finicky either way, but not bad by any stretch. Removing the top panel exposes the top I/O units, which have been left behind, a nice touch to prevent cable management issues later. And now we have a nearly completely torn down P300A, so let's check out the parts box and get on with the build. It's stored in the drive cage, as most are, and contains a parts bag, RMA contact slip, and a manual. Parts-wise, we've got a few sets of fan screws, a pile of 2.5-inch drive and motherboard screws with a sneaky power supply unit screw in the pile, a set of power supply unit screws, an additional standoff, 2 long thumb screws for something not alluded to in the manual, and a pile of zip ties. Speaking of manual, it's a pretty good one as they go. Solid explanations all round, an offline real-world DLC store, and a handy section noting all the true clearances for radiator positions, which is excellent, but no GPU width clearance section, only length. No RGB in this one, by the way, that's the P300 model. Onto the build, the power supply unit goes in first with all the cables pre-installed. This one's the 750W Strider Gold series that SilverStone sent over a while back. It's a stubby 140mm long model which gives a little more space for cable management inside. With the case tipped on its side, the motherboard can be lowered in. The standoff posts hold it in place nicely, and the open top makes installing and recording this a touch easier. CPU cooler clearance on this sits at 165mm, the Scythe Mugen 5 here sitting at 155mm tall. This isn't the test system, by the way. I'll have to change this out for the micro-ATX board before getting onto the testing later. Now for the drives. Starting with the 2.5-inch drive sled, it's a case of removing it, adding screws and the drive, and slotting it back in place. It doesn't get much easier than that. For the 3.5-inch drives, they rely on the sleds in the front in the drive cage. This style of sled is pretty common and relies on the arms with posts to hold the drives in place. Really easy to use, and if you need to, you can screw 2.5-inch drives into each of these as well. Now for a pile of cable management, and it's a pretty good experience in this case. There's a healthy amount of room in the shaft up the left side, but the cable management loops to the bottom are in awkward places. One's right to the edge at the back, and the other's right underneath the 2.5-inch drive sled. I was going to say there could be a few more millimeters of depth behind the motherboard tray, but there's plenty of room to the lower section at the front, so it's really hard to complain. The NZXT grid fitted in really nicely in the blank space next to the drive, and it could even go to the other side if the screws were removed. Back to the front to hook up all the cables, there's plenty of conveniently placed holes to reduce the amount of cable on show, and the CPU power or EPS connector easily went through the gap up top. Having the hole extend into the horizontal face of the frame is a real plus in this situation, but they could have removed the small section of material at the top, like with the Neo Air, to make it even better. As for the graphics card, I couldn't use my ratchet screwdriver with screwdriver bits properly since the shaft was too wide and marked the paint, so I had to swap out for a fixed driver, something to bear in mind for prospective owners. The card slotted in place without much of an issue, but replacing the screws was a real chore. It seemed to come down to the holes of the PCI Express slots not aligning with the card's holes, or the other way round. To avoid placing blame where I shouldn't, I grabbed my 390X and swapped it out for the 1070. For some reason or another, it fitted perfectly. I'm not sure what the reason is for this, since I've installed the 1070 in all cases I've reviewed and it's not had issues like this. Tight in some cases, but not uninstallable to this degree. There was no flex in the rear of the chassis, which is great from a build quality standpoint, but no good for me here. However, something that occurred to me was the design of the supplied screws. The tips of them were flat, or technically cup-tipped I think. So I grabbed a couple of cone-tipped screws and gave them a shot. After a second try, they managed to do the job nicely, but I'm not 100% on why this one was such a struggle. Maybe the holes could do with shifting back a millimeter or so. Final stretch now, the graphics card can be hooked up with power. I'll get myself some more fancy cables at some point, but stock will do for now. The top can be replaced along with the 15 screws. I'd like to see that cut down in the future to make open top tinkering easier. Next is the steel side panel. It can be a bit of a chore to replace this if the cables aren't tucked into the larger voids available. You may find yourself wrestling with one of the hooks if it's not tidy enough. I know I did on some occasions. And finally, the front and side window panels. So there we have the build. Now it's time to remove the film and prepare for some testing. In the future, I'm gonna do this a little differently. Since my ATX and micro ATX test systems use the same micro ATX board due to the extremely similar socket positions, I can't test using this ATX board, so I need to rebuild half the system. In the future, to save time, I'll just install the ATX board solo to analyze any points of clashes or issue, and just build onto the micro ATX board instead of building the system twice. But this time I did it the long way round. With the board swapped out and our test system ready to go, we're ready for some acoustic and thermal testing. I've got a few different setups to test, so we'll run through those quickly first. The first setup is the stock full speed setup, which means the only case fans we'll be using are the ones that came with the case, and they'll be running at full speed. It's worth noting that the CPU cooler's fan is fixed to 75% speed based on its acoustic output on the test bench measured previously, and the graphics card fans will be fixed to 50% for all tests. The second setup is the acoustic setup. Here we remove the stock fan and fill up all the fan slots with EVGA Vardar F4 120 ERs. So here we've got two front intakes, one top exhaust and one rear exhaust. They're all labeled to remain consistent from case to case, and they'll be spinning at whatever speed meets the 36.5 dBA target, which is measured at 40 centimeters away from the case at a 45-degree angle from the front. We'll get into more detail about that in the graphs. The third and final test setup is the full speed setup. This takes the identical fan arrangement in the acoustic setup and spins all the case fans up to full speed. So with all the setups out of the way, let's get into some graphs. We'll start with Priority 5 and Firmark 10-minute test, while intermittently switching to the cooling setup graphs to further analyze the results and setups. In order of GPU temperature, the P300A sits just behind the Neo Air, but in terms of CPU temperature, the P300A is the hottest on the board. This doesn't mean a great deal when all fans of all the cases are running at full speed, so checking out the cooling setup of the stock full speed tests reveals that the better GPU temperature of the Neo Air is probably down to the second fan running, down by the GPU. But that second fan isn't making the Neo Air any louder than the P300A, both sitting at 37.5 dBA despite the differences in fans, all of which are pretty much running at the same speed. However, the Neo Air is a larger case, around 5.5 litres larger, but very similarly priced, around £50 to $60. Packing the case full of fans and tuning their speeds to the 36.5 dBA target has the P300A fall down the ranks, but we're only talking a difference of a couple of degrees hotter than the Neo Air. However, the DP301M has managed to leapfrog both the Neo Air and P300A, and checking out the cooling setup we can see why. The DP301M is pretty much the same size as the P300A, but it seems like its more sealed front panel prevents a lot of noise escaping the front of the case. Since the P300A's front panel is comprised of a single perforated sheet of metal with no filter, it would appear the noise flooded out of the front in comparison, so the fans had to be tuned down just to 550 RPM to meet the target, whereas the fans on the DP301M and the Neo Air were able to spin faster, increasing the air changes and in turn the performance. And finally, for the Prime 95 testing, the full speed tests put the Neo Air on top. 5 degrees hotter is the P300A, and the DP301M seems to be put back in its expected place. I can imagine the small front intake created quite the bottleneck when 5 120mm fans are spinning up to 2200 RPM. Something else to take into account here is the noise levels. Due to the P300A's front-end design, it leaks quite a lot of noise, so it's the second loudest of the pack, which seems to be a running trend for it. The single rear fan provided a decent balance, but for those of you who are looking for a quiet build that's tricked out, you might want to give this case a second thought. Now, onto some more performance-targeted benchmarks. Starting with Cinebench, a heavy CPU load rendering benchmark, the P300A seemed to cope well with just a single rear fan at max speed, but nothing so impressive that significantly separated it from the rest. The acoustic test shifted the P300A into last place while increasing the CPU temperatures, all down to the very leaky front panel requiring the fans to spin a lot slower to meet the acoustic target. But spinning all the case fans up to full speed sent the P300A right to the top with a good bump in thermal performance. So it's got the goods if you want it, but it won't shut up about it. Changing over to a GPU load heavy benchmark, Unigen Superposition is here to help out. Don't be overwhelmed by the bars. You can mostly ignore all the grey ones being frames per second data, which don't really change unless the thermals get really bad. Here we see the P300A performing not all that well with the stock rear fan going all out. Again, the acoustic results don't seem to paint a better picture. Despite the better thermals than the stock results, it's now back of the pack, but to be fair, it's within tolerance of the two smaller cases, and to be fair to the Neo Air, the P300A is well behind thanks to that super leaky front panel. But maybe it's not all down to the front panel. Or maybe it is. Spinning the fans up maintains the P300A's position in last place with the two smaller cases, and well away from the Neo Air. It would appear the GPU thermal performance isn't as strong as the front panel's full ventilation would suggest. And finally, Hitman. Again, the grey bars are mostly irrelevant here. The P300A isn't doing very well GPU temp-wise, but completely fine on the CPU temps. The acoustic test again sends the P300A to the back of the pack a whole 6 degrees hotter than the Neo Air, and enough to start nibbling away at the GPU clock speed. Sorry for the key switching, by the way, XL doesn't like playing fair sometimes. Again, the full speed test gives us more of the same. While the P300A's CPU temps are good, the GPU just isn't getting the cooling performance like it does in other cases of varying designs. So let's wrap this up pretty quickly. Performance-wise, full load performance is good. It's not exceptional, it's not top of the leaderboards, it's good. That's slightly surprising though, and it was slightly surprising to me over cases like the Q500, Q300L from Cooler Master, which had fundamental issues because of the full front mesh backed by a secondary sort of structural plane which had holes through it, which wasn't strong in ventilation. This one doesn't have that. It just has a series of small holes, penetrations through the front panel and no panel behind without even a filter. So it's surprising that it didn't perform better than say the Neo Air in quite a few scenarios. The acoustic performance is pretty poor. So if you were going for a really quiet build and you were using, say, high-end components, then you'd probably want to pass on this and look for something a little better. I think there's a limit to the idea that if you just allow full front ventilation, then you have to turn the fans down and therefore you make things quieter or something like that, or you can turn them up because there's less air resistance and less noise of air going through, and then you can have more performance. I think this is the limit to that, and you kind of need to seal the front off a little bit more to get the acoustic performance you would want, hence why so many really quiet cases aren't fully open. So if you get a test bench, it is obviously going to be loud because there's nowhere for the noise to lose its energy before coming out of the case. Perforations with fans just behind it come straight out. And wrapping that up then, if you were going for a quiet build, mid-range components, if you weren't pushing them to the limit, then you could probably be completely fine in this case. No issue. High performance components would avoid. Low performance components, don't even worry about it. It'll be fine. I wouldn't worry too much. Just keep an eye on fan curves and stuff and you should be fine, as you should with pretty much every build. There's no point on using the fans more than you actually have to. Most of the case, when you turn fans up to full speed, your performance benefits are negligible, so it's not really worth doing. And I'd say the stock performance with the single fans at the rear is good. It's not leaderboard breaking, it is good solid performance. You might want to throw an extra fan in the front, probably GPU side, just to help the GPU a little bit more, but it was pretty solid. One thing I didn't mention in the review because I didn't think it would be that important, but I do think it's something worth noting is, if I actually turn it on, you've got lighting to the front there, and a little lighting around the back, or the back lighting around the edge of the power button at the top. But the one down there seems to be like a little glint to the side of the panel, the edge of the panel, which seems quite nice. It's subtle, it's not overstated, but it adds to the general idea of this case. Is it's just a clean look, and it's just a nice little accent to it. Nothing outrageous. It's not RGB, it's just a single color. But if you go for the P300 version, then I don't know if that light is there. You have to check that out yourself. But the button up here does change lighting effects, so fans and that sort of stuff. Build quality then, like I mentioned, I had issues with the GPU at the back because the build quality was really solid. Normally in sort of, I don't know, cheaper cases, I wouldn't say so much. Just other cases, you can flex the back a little bit, press it in and get a little bit of give for it, and then make things work, like any screw alignment issues. But this one was very solid, so good. The front I'd be wary of. If you were to whack a screwdriver into that, drop something on it, if you left it lying on the floor with, you know, panel side up, then yeah, you would probably put a dent into that, so be careful of that. And then finally, let's get on to would I recommend it. Price wise, we're looking at £60, $60, which is surprising because normally there's a different pounds to dollars conversion, but that's just the way PC components go a lot of the time. And then €55, so it's really well priced. It's great build quality. It's got all the cable management that you would want. It's got room for expansion if you really want to, so you can throw in an extra 2.5-inch drive, solid front 3.5-inch drive positions, and yeah, I don't think there's a huge amount more to discuss on that. There were no fan issues in terms of throwing fans in and then clipping. They actually have the offsets around on the screw mounts or screw in positions, so that's good. And I really don't think there's much more to say about it. It's a solid thing. I would get rid of the captive screws because, frankly, 2 secs. Having a case like this, I think this is like an Phanteks 300. It's just a well-knurled screw, and although it's not the easiest thing to put in, you know, it works properly, and you can be relatively sure that you're going to avoid stripping a thread. On these captive screws, stripping threads is pretty common. You can't properly do the reverse or counterclockwise to hear the notch or the click and then rotate in, which is just the sensible thing to do in most cases. Same with motherboard standoffs and that sort of thing. You just can't do it. You can't see the screw, the proper screw hole or the bore or whatever you call it. You just have to hope on blind luck that it works. I mean, there is a slight vision, but it's, you know, you're never really going to get a solid look on it. So there we go, that's it. Would I recommend it? It's decently priced and it has good performance, so yeah, why not? It's not the gamery look most people want, or a lot of people want, I guess. I don't know what most of the market want, really. But yeah, it's good, and yeah, would recommend. So, oh yeah, final point, this is just channel talk. I have had issues in the last couple of reviews getting lighting and color to be good. You may see there are sort of light spots and patches. I'm working with small LED panels to reduce the amount of sort of stuff in this room to make it more compact. Working with a slightly smaller space than I was, only slightly, but you know, trying to reduce the size of components. So there have been issues in that regard, a bit of a pain. And also I did try out having little icons in the bottom corners of the screen here and there, just to show compatibility stuff. I'll be progressing with those. I might want to put something like a like 120mm fan X2 for, you know, or ×2 to be able to show what can be put in there. And I am finding it tricky to say or to present this is a 280mm radiator with 2 140s or a 240 with 2 120s to make it space efficient, rather than being like, oh, you can throw all this into it, which obviously you can't, but somebody might get the wrong idea, so I need to figure that out. But you know, if you like them, then let me know, and I'll try and tweak them so that they're better. It just means that if I accidentally forget to mention something, then the information's there and I can put it in post with a little pop-up thing, like a boop sort of thing, a pop sound, and it'll just bring attention to, you know, that kind of thing. Maybe I want a different sound for that and a different effect, so people know that, oh, that's a compatibility noise, so we know, you know, what's there. Compatibility noise. That could be interesting. Anyway, thanks guys. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.